Just need a quiet minute. Maybe you're tired, maybe life's weighing heavy, and you find a spot to just breathe.
Hey! Yo! Alberto,
Huh?
what are you doing?
Oh, I fell asleep.
You know you're trespassing out here, right? Is this yours?
No, that's my house.
But cops can't see a homeless man resting and ask him to leave, then beat him and paralyze him.
Put your shoes on, you can come over to my car, I'm gonna write you a ticket, okay?
Okay. All right.
Actually,
Put my shoes.
S41 is the van here, by any chance? Hey, can you come over to 251 15th Street and S41? This is gonna be a trespassing on B15.
Oh, you know my ticket?
Yeah, come on over to the car.
Okay.
For a man in this park, that moment of rest turned into a masterclass in how everyday police interactions can spiral.
You got everything that's yours? You're leaving your beer cans behind?
The body cam footage begins
Yeah,
with
right.
an ordinary street scene, the kind of quiet, almost forgettable moment that anyone might overlook. A man sits quietly, seeking a brief pause from life's relentless pressures. In these first few seconds, there is a striking contrast. A vulnerable human being seeking nothing more than a small moment of relief, and the looming presence of law enforcement poised to convert minor inconveniences into procedural justification. What starts as a seemingly routine interaction quickly begins to reveal the subtle ways power can be leveraged, how authority can dictate the pace, tone, and outcome of a situation in ways that feel immediate and inescapable. The moment is deceptively calm, yet tension underpins every exchange. The officer's words and actions introduce a concept that will later escalate. Control framed as routine, the veneer of legality masking deeper discretionary judgment. This early interaction lays the foundation for understanding escalation in policing. The man's compliance and non-confrontational posture do not prevent the officer from setting the narrative. By determining the trajectory of the interaction, what is acceptable behavior, what is tolerated, what is punishable, the officer asserts dominance. The minute details, such as instructions about personal belongings, movement, and physical posture, carry weight beyond their immediate practical purpose. They establish a rhythm of authority that subtly conditions the subject to respond within narrowly defined parameters. The process begins incrementally, almost imperceptibly, but it is designed to create a hierarchy in which resistance is not an option, and compliance is the prerequisite for survival. The footage shows the officer repeatedly referencing the subject's past behavior and perceived patterns of defiance. Here the law becomes malleable in the hands of the enforcer, shaped less by statutory requirements and more by subjective interpretation. The officer frames a personal judgment as a procedural inevitability, merging past grievances with current circumstances. This technique, familiar to behavioral analysts and criminal justice scholars, is a subtle form of coercion. The man's awareness of potential consequences is heightened by the officer's selective referencing of complaints and prior incidents. This strategy, though legal in appearance, functions as a psychological lever, amplifying the tension in a situation that might otherwise be mundane. The incremental imposition of directives is methodical. Each command, request, and observation carries dual functions: logistical necessity and psychological pressure. By insisting on specific movements, item placement, and physical inspection, the officer not only ensures control over immediate circumstances, but also communicates a broader assertion of institutional power. The interaction illustrates how procedural protocols can mask discretionary overreach. These early moments reveal the insidious potential of routine stops where minor infractions are magnified through procedural ritual into moral judgment, and compliance is achieved not through cooperation but through a careful orchestration of authority. The analysis of body language and tone in these early interactions is critical. Even without overt aggression, there exists a clear imbalance. The officer's physical positioning, voice modulation, and repeated references to consequences serve as constant reminders of the power dynamic. The man's posture, expressions, and hesitations convey vulnerability and uncertainty. In studies of policing and citizen interaction, such nonverbal cues often precede escalation, functioning as both predictor and amplifier of conflict. The psychological impact of these subtle manipulations is profound. They normalize a state of heightened alertness in the subject, increasing compliance yet simultaneously deepening anxiety, setting the stage for the eventual injury that will dominate the later narrative. The interaction with the subject's personal property illustrates another key dimension of procedural overreach. The inventory search, while legally justified in certain contexts, is conducted with a tone of contempt and dismissal. The officer's handling of personal items communicates a moral judgment intertwined with the act of seizure itself. Objects that belong to the man, which carry personal significance and utility, are treated as disposable, reinforcing the perception of the man not as a citizen but as an object to be managed. The combination of procedural authority and implicit moral condemnation heightens the sense of powerlessness, a hallmark of encounters that escalate from compliance to physical harm. As the situation progresses, the officer frames incarceration as a choice rather than a consequence, a personal decision rather than a legal requirement. This framing is critical to understanding the abuse of authority at play. By asserting that the arrest is driven by complaints, prior interactions, and perceived non-compliance, the officer detaches the act from its statutory basis. This move exemplifies a broader issue within policing systems. When discretion supersedes strict adherence to legal thresholds, the balance between lawful enforcement and arbitrary power tilts dramatically. Citizens are left vulnerable to subjective interpretation, where being perceived as problematic becomes as actionable as committing a legal infraction. The footage provides a clear example of how minor infractions, loitering, failure to observe posted signs, and minor trespassing can be transformed into justification for punitive measures. This phenomenon, often referred to as the criminalization of poverty, illustrates the intersection between law enforcement, social inequality, and institutional practice. By emphasizing past behavior, complaints, and patterns of perceived misconduct, officers can construct a narrative in which legal authority is conflated with moral authority. This framing is critical to understanding not only the events that follow, but also the broader implications for civil liberties and public accountability. One of the most striking aspects of the early footage is the meticulous nature of procedural escalation. Each step, each instruction, each adjustment in posture or positioning is designed to assert control while maintaining an appearance of routine policing. The man's cooperation does not mitigate the incremental imposition of authority. Instead, compliance is met with further instructions and conditions. This layered approach demonstrates a core principle in escalation psychology. Small, repeated assertions of dominance can, over time, condition a subject to accept outcomes that are disproportionate to the initial infraction. In this case, these cumulative pressures set the stage for a catastrophic outcome, transforming an administrative interaction into a life-altering injury. Throughout these opening minutes, the narrative of authority is closely intertwined with vulnerability and procedural formality. The bodycam footage allows viewers to witness a microcosm of law enforcement dynamics, the juxtaposition of an individual's minimal agency against the institutionally reinforced power of the officer. Even without physical violence, the mechanisms of control, verbal framing, body positioning, inventory protocols, and subjective referencing of prior behavior illustrate how power can be exercised in subtle, psychologically coercive ways. These early sequences provide essential context for understanding the subsequent injury, highlighting that physical harm often emerges from a chain of procedural, psychological, and discretionary pressures rather than from sudden, unpredictable acts. The use of language in these initial interactions deserves careful examination. The officer's phrasing, punctuated by declarative statements and implied judgments, shapes perception and response. By framing the arrest as a consequence of cumulative dissatisfaction rather than an immediate legal violation, the officer communicates that compliance alone may not prevent punitive outcomes. This strategy aligns with behavioral research on authority. Individuals are more likely to submit when the consequences are framed as inevitable or morally justified. The footage exemplifies how law enforcement can leverage linguistic and procedural tools to assert dominance while maintaining a superficial appearance of legality, a dynamic that is critical for analyzing the escalation toward injury. In conclusion of this segment, the first portion of the footage provides a textbook case of procedural escalation, discretionary overreach, and psychological conditioning. The man's compliance, vulnerability, and lack of prior intent
do not prevent the officer from constructing a narrative that justifies punitive action. The meticulous attention to property, posture, and verbal
Framing underscores a broader issue in policing practices. The convergence of authority, discretion, and subjective judgment creates a high-risk environment for citizens, particularly those who are marginalized. This foundation is essential for understanding how the situation will progress, as minor decisions and incremental pressures compound into catastrophic consequences, demonstrating the critical importance of accountability and procedural scrutiny in law enforcement. As the interaction escalates, the footage transitions from procedural dominance to overt misuse of authority. The officer's repeated framing of incarceration as a choice rather than a legal mandate becomes more pronounced. Each reference to complaints, prior tickets, and perceived defiance reinforces a narrative of moral judgment, shifting the dynamic from law enforcement to personal retribution. The man's compliance does not alter the trajectory. Instead, it highlights the asymmetry of power. This moment provides a crucial case study in the psychology of escalation. Compliance alone does not mitigate the imposition of authority when discretionary judgment supersedes statutory requirement. The inventory search is particularly revealing. While the law permits officers to catalogue a detainee's belongings for safety and liability reasons, the manner in which it is executed conveys a deep sense of moral condemnation. Objects are handled with visible disdain, and personal items are discarded with little regard for necessity or care. This treatment reinforces the power imbalance. The subject is not only physically subordinate, but also socially devalued. By demonstrating contempt through procedural action, the officer converts routine protocol into a psychological tool for subjugation. Behavioral analysis suggests that such practices compound stress and heighten vulnerability, creating conditions in which physical harm becomes more likely during subsequent transport. The discussion of probable cause and criminal intent is critical at this stage. The subject's assertion that he did not see signage is more than a procedural detail. It undermines the legal basis for the arrest. Criminal trespass requires intentional and knowing refusal to leave, elements that are contingent on clear notification and comprehension. By arresting a subject based on historical behavior and community complaints rather than a present, verifiable violation, the officer enters a gray zone where Fourth Amendment protections are compromised. This legal ambiguity is amplified by the officer's framing of jail as a consequence of being a problem rather than committing a specific offense, reflecting an institutional tendency to conflate nuisance management with criminal enforcement. The footage also illuminates the dynamics of power projection during physical interaction. Even in the absence of overt violence, the officer's positioning, repeated verbal instructions, and insistence on compliance signal dominance. Each command about clothing, personal items, and movement operates on multiple levels: logistical control, psychological conditioning, and reinforcement of social hierarchy. This nuanced manipulation of authority illustrates the subtle, cumulative nature of escalation. Studies in law enforcement psychology demonstrate that repeated assertions of control, even when procedural, can prime subjects for heightened stress responses, reducing their capacity to respond effectively and increasing susceptibility to injury during subsequent physical handling. One of the most striking aspects is the framing of incarceration as a moral corrective. The officer repeatedly references the subject's history, suggesting that prior non-compliance justifies a harsher immediate response. This tactic mirrors elements of broken windows policing, where minor infractions are used to rationalize broader punitive measures. While intended to maintain order, such practices disproportionately impact marginalized populations, transforming transient or circumstantial behavior into grounds for significant deprivation of liberty. The footage offers a stark example of how law enforcement discretion, when left unchecked, can intersect with social inequality to produce outcomes that exceed the proportionality of the original offense. The psychological burden on the subject is compounded by medical vulnerability. The man exposes a hernia during the interaction, a physical condition that signals heightened risk during physical handling and transport. The officer ignores this, prioritizing procedural progression over the health and safety of the detainee. This disregard exemplifies a core concern in civil rights law: the duty of care owed to individuals in custody. Neglecting such factors transforms a procedural arrest into a potential violation of constitutional protections, particularly the 8th and 4th Amendments. The footage highlights how failure to account for vulnerability, combined with discretionary overreach, can precipitate severe injury. As the encounter moves toward physical transport, the underlying mechanisms of escalation become clear. The officer's repeated references to prior complaints, coupled with procedural imperatives, establish a framework in which compliance does not reduce risk. The psychological conditioning, procedural overreach, and disregard for vulnerability converge during transport, where the potential for injury is highest. Here, the intersection of human error, discretionary power, and systemic practices reveals the fragility of citizen protections in high-stakes situations. The man's eventual injury is not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a series of controlled, calculated, and poorly mitigated decisions. The transport sequence, though brief on footage, is the most consequential. The officer's deliberate actions during the vehicle ride, specifically stopping short and disregarding the man's physical condition, illustrate a profound misuse of authority. This moment crystallizes the abstract dynamics observed earlier: procedural dominance, discretionary overreach, moral framing of punishment, and disregard for vulnerability. The resultant injury is catastrophic, a fractured neck and subsequent paralysis. This outcome underscores the tangible consequences of subtle, cumulative power abuses, demonstrating how micro-level decisions can generate macro-level harm. The aftermath highlights the failure of accountability mechanisms. The officer does not verify the detainee's condition post-incident, revealing institutional gaps in oversight and duty of care. This omission reflects broader systemic issues, including inadequate training on risk mitigation, insufficient checks on discretionary power, and cultural norms that may prioritize procedural completion over human safety. The footage thus serves as a case study not only in individual misconduct, but also in structural vulnerabilities that allow such incidents to occur and remain unaddressed until legal intervention is pursued. The legal implications of this sequence are profound. The arrest lacks clear probable cause, the handling violates principles of reasonable care, and the resultant injury represents a potential civil rights violation under Section 1983 of the U.S. Code. The footage exemplifies the intersection of legal theory and real-world application. What begins as a routine enforcement action can rapidly evolve into a constitutional issue when discretion, negligence, and disregard for procedural safeguards converge. The narrative underscores the importance of scrutiny, both at the level of individual actions and within broader institutional frameworks. Throughout this segment, the footage illustrates the intricate choreography of escalation. The officer's actions are not haphazard. They follow a patterned sequence that reflects training, discretionary judgment, and individual decision-making. Each procedural step, from property inspection to verbal framing, contributes to a cumulative environment in which the man's vulnerability is exploited, ultimately leading to physical harm. This pattern highlights a critical insight. Systemic abuse often emerges from a series of seemingly minor, individually defensible actions that, in combination, produce catastrophic outcomes. Understanding this cumulative effect is essential for evaluating both accountability and policy reform. By the end of this section, the interplay between psychological control, procedural authority, and physical consequence is starkly evident. The footage provides an unflinching view of how legal authority, when exercised without sufficient oversight or regard for individual circumstances, can create conditions for irreversible harm. The man's compliance, vulnerability, and legal innocence contrast sharply with the officer's discretionary power, illustrating the inherent risks in environments where institutional authority is concentrated and insufficiently checked. The events depicted here serve as both a cautionary tale and a compelling argument for reform in policing practices, particularly around transport, procedural escalation, and the treatment of vulnerable populations. The final segment of the footage presents a stark examination of consequences, accountability, and systemic failure. Following the injury, the footage emphasizes the complete disregard for the detainee's welfare. The officer's inattention to immediate medical needs exemplifies a critical breakdown in the duty of care. In law enforcement, the responsibility to safeguard individuals in custody is fundamental. Neglecting this duty transforms a procedural interaction into an actionable civil rights violation.
The video frames the aftermath not simply as an accident, but as the logical endpoint of cumulative misjudgment, discretionary overreach, and institutional tolerance of risk. Analyzing the transport mechanics reveals both negligence and intent. The deliberate stopping, combined with a lack of safety protocols, converts the van from a secure transport environment into a site of predictable harm. This illustrates the intersection of human error and discretionary authority. Even when intent may not be malicious in the traditional sense, the choices made demonstrate reckless disregard for foreseeable outcomes. The analysis underscores a critical principle in both criminal and civil law. Accountability is not limited to malicious acts, but extends to grossly negligent execution of lawful duties. The footage also highlights systemic vulnerabilities in oversight mechanisms. The absence of immediate reporting, verification of detainee condition, or supervisory intervention reflects structural deficiencies. This failure is not merely administrative. It signals an institutional environment in which discretionary abuse can occur with minimal risk of detection or consequence. Scholars of criminal justice and public administration note that such gaps often perpetuate cycles of misconduct as unchecked behaviors become normalized and systemic expectations shift toward tolerating risk rather than mitigating it. The personal impact on the victim is profound and enduring. The man's paralysis transforms the encounter from an abstract procedural violation into a tangible, life-altering harm. The footage underscores the human cost of discretionary overreach. Legal rights, personal dignity, and physical autonomy converge to highlight the stakes of everyday policing. In examining these effects, the footage serves as a reminder that civil liberties are inseparable from human consequences. Violations are not theoretical, but material, measurable, and lasting. This perspective reinforces the necessity of stringent oversight and proactive safeguards within law enforcement institutions. Legal analysis further illuminates the gravity of the events. The arrest, predicated on subjective
Evaluation rather than specific probable cause challenges fundamental constitutional principles. Fourth Amendment protections, designed to shield citizens from unreasonable seizure, were arguably circumvented through discretionary overreach. Section 1983 civil claims provide a statutory avenue for addressing such abuses, reflecting the tension between individual rights and institutional authority. The footage exemplifies the practical implications of these laws. What appears as routine enforcement on the surface may, upon closer examination, reveal substantial violations of fundamental protections. The role of institutional culture in shaping officer behavior is also evident. Training protocols, operational expectations, and informal norms collectively influence discretionary decisions. The footage highlights how an environment that tacitly prioritizes compliance over welfare, enforcement over proportionality, or procedural completion over human safety creates conditions in which injuries are not merely possible but probable. Recognizing this relationship between culture and outcome is critical for comprehensive reform. Interventions must address not only individual actors, but also the structural and cultural factors that enable misconduct. The psychological dimensions of the incident are equally significant. The officer's repeated framing of punitive action, coupled with dismissive handling of the detainee's vulnerabilities, illustrates the interplay between authority, perception, and stress. Behavioral science demonstrates that such dynamics can intensify risk, as both the enforcer and the subject operate under heightened cognitive and emotional pressures. In this case, the consequences manifest physically with catastrophic outcomes, highlighting the material effects of psychological dynamics within high-stakes law enforcement environments. The post-incident legal and societal response underscores the importance of transparency and accountability. Civil lawsuits, public scrutiny, and media dissemination play pivotal roles in highlighting systemic flaws and advocating for reform. The footage demonstrates how real-time evidence captured through bodycams becomes an essential tool in both documenting misconduct and supporting claims for justice. Beyond individual consequences, such documentation informs broader policy discussions, shaping training, oversight, and operational standards in ways that have long-term implications for civil rights protection. Finally, the footage serves as a broader commentary on institutional ethics and the moral responsibilities inherent in positions of authority. Officers are entrusted with the safety, liberty, and dignity of citizens.
When discretion is exercised without sufficient regard for legal and ethical constraints, the consequences extend beyond individual incidents to erode public trust and institutional legitimacy. The narrative illustrates that accountability is not merely a procedural requirement,
but a societal imperative. The rights, safety, and well-being of citizens depend upon vigilance, oversight, and ethical exercise of power.